Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us in this beautiful Ackerman Hall of the Carlos Museum. I am delighted to welcome you to an event being co-hosted between the Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry and The Guardian, as well as News Media Alliance. You're here to experience the fight to vote. I'm Carla Freeman, the director of the Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry at Emory, and I'm really delighted to be here. It's wonderful to see so many of our students and our faculty, our alumni. Happy homecoming to those of you who are our alumni, and friends from the public. I'm sending out a hearty welcome as well to our live audience who are joining us on YouTube, Emory's YouTube channel. As many of you know, the annual theme of the Fox Center this year is democracy, past, present, and future. Our 24 Fox Fellows include Emory faculty visiting from Spelman and Georgia State, postdoctoral and graduate fellows writing PhD dissertations and books, as well as a dozen very talented undergraduate fellows writing their honors theses on topics related to democracy, examining its promises, its fault lines, and foreclosures in diverse locations, from sundown towns in the American Midwest to Putin's Russia, and analyzing punk rock as a medium of dissent in the Czech transition from communism to democracy, to the surveillance of women's rights in contemporary China. In this frantic stretch before the November election, tonight's spotlight on the United States brings together scholars, journalists, and activists on the past, present, and future of voting rights and voter suppression, what's old and what's new when we consider where we are now, in 2024, in Georgia, as well as nationally. I want to welcome Julie Mashak, the Guardian's Director of Philanthropy, Strategic Programs, and Events, joining us today from New York, and Kira Lerner, Deputy Washington Editor for The Guardian US, who have worked really closely with our team in the Fox Center to organize this gathering. Kira Lerner joins us from DC, where she oversees coverage of democracy issues. Needless to say, a busy beat in recent years. She's previously reported on voting rights and elections for other outlets, including States Newsroom and Vote Beat, and I invite her to tell us a bit about The Guardian's ambitious and important, and I think quite novel decision to designate a whole team to expand news coverage on threats to democracy in America. So before I introduce our panelists, I want to welcome Kira to the podium to tell us a little bit about what The Guardian is up to.
Thank you so much, Carla. Hi, everyone. I'm Kira Lerner, and like she said, I oversee the democracy team as the Deputy Washington Editor for The Guardian US. We are thrilled to be here tonight co-hosting this event with Emory's Fox Center. Thank you to everyone who's helped make this happen, including our event sponsor, the News Media Alliance. I don't know if I speak for everyone here when I say that I have a pit in my stomach right now, and I'm not talking about pre-event jitters. This is the pit that has formed as it's dawned on me in the last few days just how close this election is, less than 2 weeks away and literally tied in the polls. And as you all know, there's so much at stake when it comes to the future of our democracy on November 5th. At The Guardian, we're working hard to make sure our readers understand the stakes of this election. Our Fight for Democracy project has revealed efforts to sow confusion and to subvert this election, whether it's spreading the myth of widespread non-citizen voting or encouraging local election officials to refuse to certify the elections on the county level. Here in Georgia, we've closely tracked the state election board, whose actions would have created potential chaos and delays after Election Day, but they've been put on hold. Our democracy reporters across the country have all become experts on things like hand counts, the vote certification process, how to spot and debunk election misinformation, and how to report on political violence. There are plenty of reasons for anxiety right now, especially here in a swing state, but what gives me hope are the people you're going to hear from tonight, the experts studying the root causes of voter suppression, demographic changes, and voter turnout, the grassroots activists working to ensure access to the ballot, and our reporters, George and Sam, who remain clear-eyed about the stakes of this election and who are gearing up for a busy election day and an even busier post-election period because we know this election won't be settled on November 5th. So thank you for joining us today. Seeing you all here gives me hope that there are people ready to protect the future of our democracy no matter what happens next month.
I share that pit in your stomach. Tonight's event will be held in two parts. First, we'll be joined by a panel of Emory faculty and one Guardian journalist, all experts on American politics, democracy, the history of race, and the vote, among other things. There will be time for questions after each of the two sessions, so please feel free, and I encourage you to take a couple of index cards. We're trying something new this time by asking people to write their questions on a card, and our moderators will be reading the questions aloud. So please don't be shy, be energetic on the question front. For the second half of our program, Lerner will be offering introductions to another of the Guardian democracy journalists, George Chidi, who you just heard about, who's based in Atlanta here, and he will be joined by our special guest, Cliff Albright, founding director of Black Votes Matter here in Atlanta. So now to introduce our panelists on the first panel. Alan Abramowitz is the Alban W. Barkley Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Emory, a scholar and public voice on American politics, elections, voter behavior, and party realignments in the U.S. The author of 7 books, most recently, The Great Alignment, Race, Party Transformation, and the Rise of Donald Trump, and The Polarized Public, Why American Government is So Dysfunctional. He's also a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the AJC, the Huffington Post, and on university campuses in the U.S. and abroad. He is widely known for his plain-spoken and nuanced take on American electoral politics. Carol Anderson is the Robert Woodruff Professor of African American Studies and an award-winning fellowship recipient, award-winning teacher, and award-winning author of 5 books, including most recently, One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Democracy, and the second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. More than anyone I know, Carol is the living embodiment of public intellectual and scholar teacher, writing often for public audiences in The Guardian, The New York Times, The Washington Post, among many others, and featured on air with the likes of Trevor Noah, Rachel Maddow, Democracy Now!, again, among many, many others. And I could go on with each one of these individuals, and I have deliberately really worked to keep my introductions brief. So Bernard Fraga is the Anne and Michael Hankin Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Emory, an expert on the ways in which race and ethnic identities shape political behavior. He is the author of an award-winning book, The Turnout Gap, Race, Ethnicity, and Inequality in a Diversifying America. And he is the recipient of numerous research grants and awards, including a Mellon Foundation grant he and Professor Carol Anderson received collaboratively called Imagining Democracy. He is a frequent contributor to the public debates on race and electoral politics in Georgia and beyond, in the Washington Post, National Public Radio, the AJC, and notably the Emory Wheel. I mentioned Professor Fraga's publication in the Emory student newspaper and the Imagining Democracy course that he and Carol Anderson are co-teaching to highlight just what a crucial role our faculty are playing, not only in publishing important scholarship shaping the world's understanding of American politics, our past, and our current moment, but the ways in which they are actively engaging our students in these debates and the electoral process itself. I'm also delighted to welcome and introduce our interlocutor and interviewer, Sam Levine from The Guardian. Sam covers voting rights across the United States for The Guardian US. He's based in New York, although he makes a lot of trips to the South and here in Atlanta in particular. He covers efforts to restrict voting, including efforts to remove voters from the voting rolls and changes to mail-in balloting, as well as gerrymandering and felon disenfranchisement. We had a really lively discussion with our fellows about all of the above earlier today. His work has focused closely in Georgia in recent years, including the passage of SB 202, changes to the state election board, and polling place closures in Randolph County.
My name's Sam Levine. I'm a reporter for The Guardian. I cover voting rights and democracy issues. And I have the easiest job tonight. It's just to shut up and let this amazing panel talk. So tonight I wanted to really have this panel focus on voting rights because this is an issue that is not just part of the political conversation. I think has become a beat and an issue that needs to be talked about as its own pillar of coverage. And because we're in Atlanta, because we're less than 2 weeks away from the election, I think we got to talk a little politics too. So I want to start off just asking our panel, we're less than 2 weeks away from the election. What are you paying attention to? Start with you,
Alan. Pretty much everything that's going on. I mean, although it gets a little overwhelming. Obviously I am in the election forecasting business, so I'm paying attention to what's going on with the various forecasting models. I'm looking at the tracking the polls, like everyone, I'm sure, almost obsessively, compulsively, probably unnecessarily, and just trying to understand what's going on, why this election. I mean, the most puzzling thing, I think, to many of us is, how is it possible that this is a close election? It just seems pretty obvious that there's one candidate who has no business being anywhere near back in office again, even in the eyes and minds of many of those who served with him in his first term in office. So, I guess that's a short answer for that.
We were talking before downstairs, and Alan said, anyone who tells you they know who's going to win the election doesn't know what they're talking about.
That's exactly right, yeah. It's very unpredictable, and a big reason for that, I don't know if we're going to talk about this at all tonight. Of course, the Electoral College is a big part of the reason for why there's so much uncertainty about the outcome of this election.
Bernard?
Yeah, so thanks so much, and it's really great to be here with all of you, and I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate the very generous welcome from Carla Freeman as well. Thank you so much for that. Similar to Alan, there's some surprise. I think that the election is close, but I'm remembering January 2021, and we talk about January 6th, obviously, and that's very important, and that's why they're surprised that it's so close. But I'm also thinking about January 5th, 2021, and if you remember here in Georgia, that was the runoff election that we had for the 2 Senate seats, and it seemed like, that election in combination with the November 2020 election was kind of the last, let's say, nail in the coffin for the kind of most extreme variants of the kind of election denial, the extremist parts of the MAGA movement. The idea was, this was a moment to really, celebrate, not just for Democrats, but I also feel like, kind of for the nation in terms of truth is prevailing. And, we're still in the middle of the COVID pandemic, a pandemic that hasn't really left us. But, the next day, January 6th, when I was, preparing to do all the discussions and interviews about the election and what happened, then, seeing the insurrection, in the days that followed that on campus, it was another sense of, this is obviously very terrible, but we avoided something really, really bad. It's never going to happen again. There'll be a whole legal process that will, make it very, very clear that this movement altogether, not just is going to be unpopular, but is going to be in many ways, imprisoned, illegal, whatever we want to say, right? That this will never happen again, and we are making sure of that. I was skeptical at that moment that it was, really going to be gone. I thought that it was really going to take the voters doing it. And slowly we started seeing Republicans kind of saying the same thing. There was an acknowledgement that, maybe Trump would run again, but there was no way that he would win a primary. So, I mean, we're in kind of strange times, but I really think that, it was that, January 5th and January 6th, 2021 have a lot to do with where we're at today and why it's so close. Because after the results of the runoff, many Republicans said we have to do whatever we can to win, even if it means jumping back on the MAGA bandwagon. And so I think that the close election, which I'm very interested in, it's again another moment when you could see, many Republicans who maybe say, well, they're voting for Trump but not sure about everything. They don't agree with him on everything. Just like for Democrats, when Biden was the nominee and even now with Harris being the nominee, will we wake up after the election and say, look, now this is in the past. No matter who wins, maybe even, we can kind of have a brighter future ahead. I'm not sold on that necessarily, but I am looking to see patterns and signs of some kind of softening of kind of the hardest of the hardcore election denial kind of strategies. And I think, again, it's a strategy, not just an analogy, but a strategy that's employed to say, no matter what, the election is not legitimate unless one side wins. So that's what I'm looking at.
Lord, what am I looking at? I'm looking at, so it's two things. I'm looking at the incredible strength of grassroots organizers who are doing the heavy work, what I call the heavy lifting of democracy. They're knocking on doors. They are talking to folk. They are getting folks to the polls. They are getting information out to voters. And so they're doing that work. And so they are getting to basically sometimes the unorganizable, and they're getting them organized. And what it takes to do that is strength, is vision, is diligence. And so that's my hope. The other piece that I'm looking at, because we're going to have church up in here. I'm looking at a nation that is comfortable with an adjudicated rapist, with a man who has almost $500 million worth of fines because of fraud, with a man who says he admires Hitler, with a man who calls the military suckers and losers. And there's nothing that he does that can shake them. And so I know what I'm looking at is basically the power of what I call pure uncut, a kilo of pure uncut white supremacy. Because what Trump brings, and I've said his name, but I won't say it 3 times because it's like Beetlejuice. Because what he brings, this is us in class, because what he brings is he gives permission to hate the people that they want to hate. He makes it okay to hate them. And so when you think about in that first election, he threw that first kilo on the table, birtherism, which was to deny the legitimacy of Barack Obama. Second kilo, Mexicans are rapists and criminals. Third kilo, build the wall. Fourth kilo, the Muslim ban. Fifth kilo, Kung flu. Next kilo, the China virus. Now he's on another set of kilos because that's what he brings to the table. And the fact that you've got such a wide swath of Americans who are addicted to that virulent, toxic, racist white supremacy is troubling, beyond troubling, because what it means is that we have, even if the election goes where the really competent woman wins, it means that we have a large swath of our population that lives in an evidence-free zone and that is comfortable with the violence and the hatred that comes out of that racist viewpoint that Trump spews. So that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at those kind of big tectonic plates. So it's that clash between that vision of a truly multiracial, multicultural democracy and what we call a Herrenvolk democracy, where you have a small strata of whites who are at the very top and a large swath of of a rightless labor pool that generates enormous resources that just eddy up to that small strata. And so it is that clash that I've got my eye on.
I want to stick with you, Carol. How confident are you that the 2024 election is going to be free and fair, and that the person who gets the most votes will be seated in the Oval Office in January 2025?
What I think is that we do have election officials who are committed to doing the work. And we have a band of our judiciary. And so, I'm not going all the way up to the Supreme Court. But we have our band of our judiciary that also believes in democracy and that has beat back a lot of the ridiculousness that has come through that tries to gum up the works, like what the state election board, Georgia State Election Board, just pulled. I believe that it's going to be free and fair, but I believe that the ground has been sown to create the illusion, if the results aren't what Trump wants, to create the illusion that something is awry. And so this is why you keep hearing about, she opened up the borders to allow all of these non-citizens to come through, and then they're registering them to vote, which is a USDA grade A prime beef lie. Let me be real clear, that's a lie. But that lie, once you say a lie enough times, over and over again, it begins to have a resonance. It begins to sound like the truth. And when you're in an information bubble where that's all you keep hearing, where you don't hear the truth, and so then when the election goes the way that it needs to go, I think that part of what we're going to see is we're going to see a massive resistance to that result. The thing that I think will help us not have a January 6th is that the levers of power are not in Trump's hands this time. So he's not in charge of DOJ. He's not in charge of the Department of Defense. And so we're going to be so the levers of power are going to be in insane hands. Not insane, but insane hands. So my confidence is that the election will go as it's supposed to go, that people are voting, that the votes will be counted. And so they have started removing the folks who refuse to certify elections. So all of those pieces are in place. But because of the information, the news, the information that is out there that is designed to sully the waters, designed to muddy the waters, designed to give the aura of something gone awry, I think that there's going to be a big hue and cry, the way we had the big hue and cry last time about election integrity. We must have integrity. And so we'll see the same doggone mess we saw then, which was those right-wing legislatures responding to the concern about election integrity, and we have to do something about all of this voter fraud.
Alan, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Carol just said, but I want to bring up a couple of things that I think might make progressives somewhat uncomfortable about that are happening in this election. One is, and this is something we were kind of talking about earlier, that a significant minority of non-white voters, including African-American voters, Latino voters, and other non-white voters, are apparently planning on voting for Donald Trump in this election, possibly a larger percentage than in the last two elections. I'm not sure that that's actually going to happen, but it looks like, and some of the polling certainly is suggesting that is a possibility, and that is a very surprising thing in a lot of ways. But then trying to understand, another thing I want to mention, by the way, Kamala Harris will probably win the popular vote. I mean, I think there's a very high probability that she will win the popular vote. Not certain, but the real risk here is that we'll have another 2016. I mean, that is a not insignificant possibility because the margin here is so close in the national popular vote and closer in the swing states that we could very well see that happen again where Trump wins in the Electoral College while losing the popular vote. The third thing I want to bring up, though, is that I think there is another possible explanation for why we're seeing Trump do surprisingly well, considering everything that's happened. And that is there is widespread discontent within the electorate about the state of the economy and about the economic conditions, even though the objective indicators are generally pretty positive. And it's not irrational. I think there are reasons why people actually feel that way, including low to moderate income folks who I think tend to feel that way, disproportionately. And I think that is a factor that is driving some of this support for Trump, is people looking back and thinking, oh, things were better for me and people like me when Trump was in the White House, in terms of my real income and how my family was doing. And that's something that I think, it's a big problem for the Democrats. Biden is unpopular, so if Biden was running, I think this election would be gone, right? But fortunately, he's not. But even so, he's dragging Kamala Harris down. His approval rating is underwater. It's not quite as bad as it was a few months ago, but it's something like minus 14, disapproval higher than approval. It's really hard to win an election when the leader of your party is that unpopular. So I think in that way, maybe it's not surprising that Trump is doing as well as he is.
Bernard, could I pick up on something Alan said? What should we make of that polling that shows President Trump doing better among black voters, among Latino voters? So much of the politics that he's brought to America have been shaped by race, have been racist, and yet we're seeing, this kind of support. What should we make of that?
Two things. First of all, I think the support is real. I always think back to like previous elections, but the day after the 2020 election, when the results were coming in and we were analyzing county level and some precinct level data that was coming in, and looked at South Texas and looked at Florida, other places too, at the Latino vote, heavily Latino areas, counties that are 90% Latino, for example, and saw a huge kind of gain by Republicans there. And some analysts, including friends of mine and people that I trust, said, there's no way this is real. This is fake. This is some weird, exit poll isn't working, or something is in demographic change. Even there were all these kind of weird explanations because people couldn't understand that there could be gains in Latino support for Trump in 2020. But there were. He did about 8 percentage points better with Latinos than he did. Now, again, Latinos are still heavily Democratic constituency in terms of voters, in terms of the broadly voting eligible population, and then including non-citizens and others in that as well. So, that's the one part. I'm worried about a similar narrative that I already see being set up for black voters in this election. And I think it's to be nuanced about it, right? The discussion has to begin with black voters are still the most reliable Democratic constituency of any other racial and ethnic group. White women, it looks like, once again, are going to vote majority Republican in this election, like they did in 2020 and 2016. So, we have to, despite Dobbs and all these other things, so I think we have to be really clear that a group shifting to the right is still groups that are so disproportionately Democratic, right, that we can't say that this is something about the coalition kind of fracturing or whatever. But it also points to this important idea that I talk about in my book, which is voter turnout. So what we saw with Latinos in 2020 was that Trump and the Republican Party more broadly in 2020 and in 2018 to some degree as well had been able to find and mobilize Latino Republicans who were conservative. And if they weren't Latino, any analyst would say, oh, that's like bread and butter, Trump kind of Republican, lower levels of education, conservative on crime, conservative on immigration, but not voting before. Didn't feel like they had a reason to vote. Didn't feel like their vote mattered, whatever it is, didn't feel like they had a voice. They turned out for Trump in 2020. So it's not Latino Democrats shifting to the Republican Party. It's Latino non-voters shifting to the Republican Party. I think we're seeing something similar with African Americans. Again, vast majority are going to be voting Democratic. But the small gains, which I think recent polling I saw from yesterday, this is real, right? It's mostly conservative black voters, Republican identifying or aligned with the Republican Party, not participating previously. The third group that I want to talk about, which is not a racial, young men. So a lot of ink spilled about what's going on with young men, misogyny, all these other parts. that's all true. But again, I think some of the shift we're seeing, where it looks like Trump is doing better with young men than he did in 2020, again, young men are mostly Democratic leaning, but now maybe 50-50 split, is non-voting young men who are emerging, becoming part of the electorate. So again, that changes the narrative about what Democrats could do, which is not very much unless they want to suppress the vote of those groups, of those Republican-leaning segments of otherwise heavily Democratic constituencies, but also says there's a ceiling. And we're seeing that with Latinos. The polling that I've seen says Republicans are not increasing their vote share from Latinos relative to 2020, but they are sustaining the share that they got. With African Americans, we might see a little bit of a surge, but come 2028, we're not going to see like a 60-40 split. And with young men, I think it's a similar story. So, some of this is actually the consequence of a more engaged electorate, is we're going to have to admit that there are Republicans in otherwise heavily Democratic-leaning groups.
Carol, I wanted to turn to voter suppression, and I wanted to ask you, we're living in an era when, people aren't being asked how many jelly beans are in a jar or how many bubbles are in a bar of soap anymore. It's a lot more subtle. And, in Georgia, after the 2020 election, there were sweeping voting changes. I mean, virtually, the vast majority of the election code has been altered in some way. When you think, what does voter suppression look like today? How subtle is it?
I say we move from Jim Crow to James Crow Esquire. But it has the same underpinnings. How do we make sure that these folks don't vote without identifying that we don't want these folks to vote? And how do we do it while looking like we're trying to protect democracy, when actually what we're really doing is sabotaging the citizenship of American citizens who happen to be Black, who happen to be Asian American, who happen to be Latino? How do we do that? And so when you looked at the 2020 election and when you look at the runoff in 2021, what you saw was a massive surge of voters here in Georgia. And they flipped the state blue. And they flipped the Senate with Ossoff and Warnock. One of the things you would hope is not the term. One of the things you would hope is that folks would look at this and go, wow, look at that embrace of democracy. Look at all of those people who didn't believe that they had a stake in this democracy before. And look how they withstood a pandemic to come out and vote. Look how they believe so much in the power of their vote. We need to embrace that. Instead, what this legislature did was it embraced the big lie. It embraced that there was massive, rampant voter fraud that shaped the election, that stole the election from Donald Trump. And so they looked at every one of those lies, and they looked at the ways that African Americans had accessed the ballot box. And so SB 202 just creates additional obstacles or shuts down those access points. What do I mean by that? So drop boxes. Drop boxes were put in place because of the pandemic, and they were under surveillance for 24/7. There was no evidence of voter fraud. So Ryan Germany, the general counsel out of the Secretary of State's office, he said there was nothing untoward about the drop boxes. Nothing happened there that looked like fraud. We looked at the tapes, no fraud. But drop boxes, because they were heavily used, particularly in the Atlanta metro area, heavily used because of the accessibility of them, they came under massive scrutiny. Fraud. And so you see an algorithm went in place that disguised itself as trying to be equitable, saying, well, there were some counties that didn't have a drop box. And so now we're saying that every county has to have at least one drop box. And we use this algorithm. Well, what that algorithm did is it removed something like 90 drop boxes from the Atlanta metropolitan area. It not only removed almost 90 drop boxes from the Atlanta metropolitan area, it changed the access to them. So instead of these drop boxes being outside 24/7 for early voting and for the general election, now they're only available for early voting, and those drop boxes have been put inside the early voting sites. And so when those sites are open, that's when you can use that drop box. But here, work with me here. If I'm going inside the building and I've got my ballot, why don't I just turn it in? So it makes drop boxes unusable, and that's what it was designed to do. And so each one of those methods that African Americans used became part of the obstacles put in place to access the ballot box. And again, it comes under the language when you read through the hearings for SB 202. They keep talking about we need to reinstill confidence in our constituency that we have free and fair elections. We have to make sure that we don't have voter fraud. So 3 recounts didn't instill confidence that there wasn't massive rampant voter fraud. Having the Republican Secretary of State and his office say, we've looked, no voter fraud, nothing that is sizable, nothing of the millions of votes that they're talking about, or the 11,780. Though that did not happen. And so what we're seeing here is, and it was a way that the fraud got identified. It got identified in Fulton County. And so it got attached with race. And again, what happens there is that you see how criminality gets linked with race, gets linked with these urban areas, and so it becomes plausible. So black folk, so it's when Rudy Giuliani, who did 3 hearings before the legislature in December of 2020, when Rudy Giuliani talked about Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman passing around USB ports as if there were cocaine and heroin. And he's like, and I was a former district attorney, U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, so I know criminals when I see them. I mean, that kind of talk got him a $148 million fine, I must say. But what it also got us was SB 202. Yeah.
And Alan, how much of a difference could these measures make in an election that's going to be as close as this one looks to be? If we're talking, 50 block votes here, 100 somewhere else, how much of a difference could that make?
Well, obviously, any effect could be enough.
Right.
When we're talking about a potential for an election, that if it's as close as it was in 2000, I don't think the drop boxes are going to make a difference. And the reason I say that is that, and because what we're actually seeing happening this year is people are voting early in person. And actually, I know there's been an interesting switch in the patterns of voting this year where now Republicans seem to be as likely to vote early as Democrats. They've been encouraged to vote early. They're ignoring some of the comments that Trump himself has made, and they're actually voting early. So are Democrats. There's a huge early voting turnout. I think we're going to see a very strong turnout. I don't think the lack of drop boxes, although it's unfortunate. I mean, I think that the stories about voter fraud are complete nonsense. But I don't think that in particular is going to make a difference. There are other things that could potentially make a difference, like challenges. We talked about earlier about some of the ability of individuals to challenge thousands of voter registrations, and then local, the county voting boards are forced to have to deal with that. And that could conceivably end up with some legitimate voters being removed from the rolls. We don't know. I don't think we know yet what the numbers are going to look like there, but that's something that could potentially make a difference. So, but I mean, overall, I'm impressed by the way that the elections being conducted in this state. I think that fortunately the courts have avoided the most egregious decisions made by the state election board that would have definitely created a lot of problems after the election. So I'm fairly confident that we're going to see an outcome here with the actual, the vote count will reflect the actual, voting preferences of the electorate. But it's not to say that there couldn't conceivably be some problems.
And I've got to say that part of the shift that you're seeing is because of the incredible work that these grassroots organizations are doing in terms of providing voter education to the populations, saying, okay, no, don't use the absentee ballots because the drop boxes aren't there and you can't trust the U.S. mail. Right. Vote early. and this is how you find your early voting site. And so it has been that education work, that voter education work that grassroots organizations are doing, because they have consistently figured out, how do you move around all of these obstacles? How do you go under them? How do you go over them? How do you go through them? And that has been so essential in Georgia.
I'm thinking during this conversation, when I first started my job at The Guardian, Cliff Albright and Latasha Brown came to visit us in our office, and we were chatting, and I think we asked them, what's one thing that people don't understand about voter suppression? And I'll never forget this. They both said, people don't get that you can't quantify voter suppression. It's something that's very difficult to measure. And, people who push back on the idea that voter suppression even exists in 2024, they say, well, look at the numbers. Early voting in Georgia, numbers are up, registrations are higher than ever, the challenges are getting thrown out, so, this is all nonsense. And I wanted to ask each of you as academics, we can start with you, Bernard, how do you think about studying an issue like this, and how do you think about bringing some quantitative metrics to this issue?
So, I study voter turnout. My book is on voter turnout. I look at racial disparities in voter turnout. I believe in voter turnout. I haven't voted yet, but I will. Voting is very important. But I actually think, and this I think builds on what, was said in the conversation that you mentioned, turnout is actually not the right metric for thinking about suppression. I think we have to think about it as the burdens, disproportionate or at least differential burdens being placed on certain groups, right? So the drop boxes, as Professor Anderson was saying, it was not so much about we're going to have them or we're not. It was the idea that it was more equal to say that you had one in every county. Every county could have had one in 2020. Some counties decided not to. They all had the power to do so, but some said, no, we don't really want to do that. Other counties said, this seems really good. Let's do it. The idea that the state came in and said, well, that we're not going to allow, that kind of discretion to local election officials to do what is best for the voters in terms of making sure that every Georgian can participate. That's like a different kind of thing. And the idea that voters are able to navigate around barriers that are put up or change the method that they're voting, that's not a sign that the barriers don't exist, right? Yes. That's the way that I try and think about things, and when I do the work, is about the burdens that voters face. Are we changing the opportunities that voters have available? Now, the issue with that kind of burden framework is that if you look at the U.S. in kind of cross-national comparison, we have a lot of opportunities to vote. Like most places don't have anywhere near the kind of robust vote-by-mail infrastructure we have in almost every single state. Most places don't have, like advanced democracies, right, in Europe and other places, early voting. That doesn't really exist. Now, we can talk about, the specific ways in which our registration system, for example, might impede voting in some ways. We can talk about how socioeconomic disparities or lack of public transit, like all of these, it's very fair, but we can't quantify the impact of those barriers by just looking at voting. It's more about the burdens. And the last reason why we can't do that is because we don't live in a world where when burdens exist, the side that is most impacted by the burdens gives up. That doesn't happen. So we don't have what in political science maybe we'd call RCT, a randomized controlled trial, or an experiment. We don't have a control group where we say, okay, there's going to be nothing that is done to inform voters that now, in order to cast a ballot by mail in this state, you need to physically send a copy of your ID with your application, even though they have your driver's license number already, and pre-fill the form for you. You have to send a copy of it. Okay. I tried to do this in the primary. It didn't work. That's why I don't do it. But, you can't really quantify that in the same way and talk about those burdens in the same way, even though, right, we do have a lot of opportunities to vote that other countries don't. And since the pandemic, many states have made it dramatically easier to vote. So to me, it's saying that in terms of a quantitative analysis, it has to be more careful, more nuanced, and be more focused on differential burdens than differential outcomes in terms of turnout.
And we have automatic voter registration.
Yeah, here in the state.
Georgia. Yeah. In other words, when you apply, which means when you apply for your driver's license, you are given the opportunity to register to vote, which results in hundreds of thousands of new voter registrations, every year. The people who register that way don't always vote, but that has a huge impact on registration among younger voters in the state. Not every state has that. So it kind of surprises me that still exists in Georgia. It went out for a while, but then it came back in, and so that makes it pretty easy to register.
Really think about in this pure kind of scientific way that is much more comfortable for social scientists to operate in. The disparities in turnout. So first of all, as I talk about in my book, and a recent Brennan Center report talks about this too, we continue to see very large disparities, gaps in the rate of voter turnout by race and ethnicity. That is, whites turn out at a higher rate than any other racial and ethnic group, basically everywhere in the country, including in Georgia, right? This is a fact. The changes in those gaps, though, right, like does it go up a little bit, does it go down a little bit, are, a product of a process of organizations doing a tremendous amount of work to mobilize to overcome those kinds of disparities. So, in some sense, the gap might be even larger if it wasn't for those kinds of mobilization effects. And post-Shelby, for example, in the discussion of voting rights since 2013, when pre-clearance was eliminated, and southern states all of a sudden had much more ability to change their election laws at will, we saw an increase in the turnout gap according to some estimates, and other estimates it's like, well, it's an increase but not super huge. Again, I don't think we can think of it as like a vacuum of like, oh, that's the only thing that changed was Shelby County v. Holder and elimination of pre-clearance. Since the early 2000s, we've had a huge increase in attention to disparities in turnout and attention to get out the vote operations being critical, especially for the Democratic Party, some now for the Republican Party. So, to me, it's really a story of we celebrate high turnout in 2020. A third of eligible Americans still did not vote. What are we doing about that?
I want to turn to some audience questions. I just quickly looked through these. These are all amazing questions. Not that I would expect anything less from Emory students, but starting with what should citizens do on November 6th if there are problems with the certification process? Carol, do you want to start?
Thanks.
Anyone can jump in.
And so I think depending upon what the issue is, you're either calling the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, or you're calling the ACLU, or you're calling the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, or you're contacting the Secretary of State's office. But you're recognizing that certification, for Georgia, certification is not discretionary. By law, by statute, it is mandatory. And so for folks say, well, I've got a hint that maybe somebody did something wrong. I'm seeing suitcases of ballots. And so I'm not going to certify. The courts have just said you can't do that. You don't have that discretion. And so if somebody is trying to mess with the certification, you say something. You see something, you say something. Right.
Well, it won't be on November 6th, though. It's going to take longer than that. I don't know when the deadline is for certification, but it's definitely not November 6th.
Alan, I want to ask you this question. Does the popular vote participation increase or decrease in the near term to a democracy's collapse? What does history teach us? And I wanted to piggyback a question about the Electoral College on there. How can we live with a system in America where the person who gets the most votes doesn't necessarily win the election? Why should we accept that as a democratic
I'm not sure what
system?
the answer is as far as how voter turnout correlates with democracies thriving or collapsing. I think we have a relatively low voter turnout, as we've been saying, and there are countries around the world that have way higher voter turnout than we do that are thriving democracies. I was talking to some Australian journalists the other day, and they have mandatory voting in Australia, and over 90% voter turnout. And they like it that way. But that's not going to happen in this country. I think the Electoral College is a joke. I mean, it's ridiculous that we still are using this system that was put in place by the framers because fundamentally they didn't trust ordinary people to vote for President of the United States. They didn't think that the regular folks, even the very small minority of them who were allowed to vote in those days, would know enough or be able to make a judge the candidates for president. But it doesn't work anything like the way they thought it would work, of course. But yeah, it's crazy, but it would require a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College. And in our polarized, nation, that is not going to happen. We haven't amended the Constitution in a long time, and it's very unlikely that there'll be any successful amendments anytime in the near future. So we're sort of stuck with this antiquated system. And anytime we have a very close popular vote, and particularly when the swing states are closer and lean toward one particular party, in this case the Republican Party, they lean more Republican, that's where we really have to worry about this happening. They don't always lean Republican, by the way. In the Obama elections, the swing states were slightly more Democratic than the nation. And the other thing that's changed in our country that really makes this sort of problem makes it more likely to happen is that there are so few competitive states. Even though when we have very close elections nationally, there are only, as you know, only 7 states are considered to be in play. When Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976 in a close election, he won the national popular vote by 2 percentage points, same as Hillary Clinton in 2016. There were something like 34 out of the 50 states that were competitive, that were battlegrounds. Every big state was a battleground in 1976. New York, California, Illinois, Texas, they were all competitive. So that was less likely that the swing states would differ much from the nation. But now, they can. And in 2020, the difference between the tipping point state that determined the outcome of the election, which was Wisconsin, and the national popular vote was almost 4 percentage points of margin. Wisconsin was 4 percentage points more Republican than the nation. And Biden won it anyway, but he won it by an extremely narrow margin. And so that's what we have to worry about, I think, in this election as well. I don't think it won't necessarily be as big a gap in this election. At least I'm hoping it won't be. Because if Kamala Harris wins the national popular vote by only 2 percentage points, boy, we could see it again. If she wins it by 3 or more percentage points, then it probably won't happen.
Next question. My family in very red states report women planning to secretly vote for Harris. Is there any indication that conservative women's support for Trump is overestimated in the polls?
We have shy Harris voters, right? So there's always been talk about, there were shy Trump voters in 2016 and 20. In the UK, I know there's been talk about shy Tory. The shy Tory vote is a phenomenon that's been, debated about whether it really exists there. I don't know. I hope so. We'll find out. They're not telling the pollsters if that's the case.
And I know that one of the things, so I've been reading a lot where they talk about women have been putting Post-it notes in the women's restroom saying, nobody can know who you vote for. It is, so basically vote Harris. These little Post-it notes that have been put in women's restrooms so that men aren't going into the women's restrooms. And so it is to let women know, to provide another source of information. And I've heard from canvassers who have been knocking on doors asking to speak to the woman of the house. And when the man answers the door, he's like, "Who are you?" And, well, I'm here for the Democrats, for the Harris campaign. Well, you can't talk to her, and close the door. And so that's why the Post-it notes are so important. And I also think, frankly, that is why having Liz Cheney out on the stump is also so important, because it's providing a permission structure to say you can be staunchly conservative and believe that democracy is at stake, believe that our Constitution is at stake, believe that the rule of law is at stake, and vote for Harris in order to be able to have a nation continue for yet another 250 years.
I would add one other thing. In addition to the possibility that there is this sort of hidden support for Harris, I'm a little skeptical about that. I hope it's true. But there is another potential advantage that Harris has, which goes back to something you were talking about earlier, a superior ground game. So it's pretty clear, I think, that the Democrats have a better funded, better organized, get out the vote effort going on in this election. They're spending more money on it. They have more people working on it. The Republicans are trying to, doing the best they can, but theirs is being largely conducted by outside groups that are unproven. So I think there is a possibility that just that ground game, that superior ground game, could make a difference of a point or two in terms of the vote in the swing states, especially because that's where it's taking place primarily.
Another question: What motivates previous non-voting Black and Latino voters to vote in 2024? Bernard, do you want to?
No, it's really interesting. I was just talking about this the other day. Last week I was at Legoland in Central Florida, right outside of Orlando, Winter Haven, right? And, being in Florida, large Latino population, right? Being at Legoland, like a lot of people kind of around my age, I have 2 toddlers, so bringing kids around, that kind of thing. And the degree to which there was comfort, very openly displaying, not so much like Trump stuff, although there was a lot of that too, but the very, I don't see it in the same way in Atlanta, guns on shirts, saying shoot to kill, this kind of thing. It was interesting. But it's a social environment where I think the idea is anyone walking into that kind of a scenario, you pick your kids up from school, whatever it is, you kind of, adjust a little bit, assimilate a little bit, if you will, into the local kind of situation, right? Some people resist that, and I get that. I have friends from Florida. They're in Gainesville, so they don't really have to do a lot of that themselves, but, that's kind of the point, right? Is that people who don't have, a solid kind of political attitude or viewpoint or whatever it is, they're going to receive a lot and take on a lot of what's kind of in the social environment that they're around. And I saw a lot of Latinos with similar, the Trump kind of paraphernalia, this kind of thing. And I thought about it, and I'm like, that might be something that I think some pollsters and analysts kind of know is happening. But it's really like an environmental thing in a lot of ways, too, where it's there's an election going on. People are talking about it a lot, not fully crystallized political views. Oh, but my friends are Republican, so I should kind of be a Republican, too. We have decades of political science research saying there's a big socialization, mostly parent to child. But when you don't have that, it's friend groups. It's the people you talk to every day. So I think some of it is just in a world where Americans are getting more and more engaged. We had record turnout in 2020. So that means almost necessarily that you have people who weren't voting now voting. People are, because of geographic polarization or whatever else, right, encountering a kind of very different political perspective, adopting that perspective oftentimes, willing to participate and have that be a key part of their identity. Again, this is among a set of voters who are already have a proclivity to conservative politics, right?
I would say one other thing, but it's important to keep in mind with the Latino vote is that it's always been far from monolithic, and that if you go back and trace the, it's quite variable over time. The share of the vote that Democratic presidential candidates have gotten among Latinos has fluctuated pretty widely anyway. So in 2004. I think it was George W. Bush won about 40% of the Latino vote, according to the exit polls. So it wouldn't be unique, and it wouldn't be that different this time. And especially in Florida, you have to understand there, Latinos are different in Florida, than they are in Texas or in Arizona or California, and because there's a much larger share who are Cuban American, and now Venezuelans. And those folks are very anti-communist, and many of them fled, repressive left-wing regimes, and seem to feel a natural affinity for the Republican Party. That's long been the case, and now I think it's true among many of the Venezuelans as well as the as well as the Cuban Americans. And it's different from what you have in in Arizona and California. And in South Texas also is a place that has a long tradition of like the pretty conservative folks who've been there and are very established for a long time, and tend to be somewhat more conservative as well. So it's very variable.
Down to our last question. Alan, I want to ask you quickly, and then for the rest of the panel, I have a different question. What?
Those are the last questions.
We're taking two. Quickly, what are the keys that for the candidate who's going to win Georgia, what do they need to do?
So the key for Harris, or for pretty much any Democrat, is what we saw in 2020 and again in 2022 in the runoff in the Senate election, and that is to get a strong African American turnout. African Americans make up about 30%, plus or minus 1 or 2% of the electorate in Georgia, and for a Democrat to win, you have to get that turnout to 30% or close to it, and win the overwhelming majority of that vote, and then win close to 30% of the white vote. And you put those together, and you get close to 50%, and then of course there is about 10% of the vote that comes from other racial and ethnic groups, and Democrats need to win a majority of that as well. So that's what I'd be watching for, on election night and in the exit polls, actually in the polling, is to see if they're hitting their numbers in that regard.
And Carol and Bernard, you talked a little bit about this, Carol, but quickly, is there anything that gives you hope in this election that things are getting better, or that some of these voter suppression issues can be overcome?
What gives me hope is, this is so funny because in class I'm the hopeful one and he's Eeyore. What gives me hope is history. That when people's backs have been put up against the wall, when democracy is at stake, the people will fight back. The people will fight back because they demand democracy. And I think that's what we're seeing with this kind of energized turnout. That's what we're seeing when we're seeing the poll numbers that look at Project 2025, and it's only got a 4% approval rating. People demand democracy, and they're willing to fight for it. And so that's where my hope is.
Trying to channel my inner, what is it, Pooh or whatever? Yeah, that's Winnie the Pooh. I don't know. Piglet is pretty optimistic, right? We are on the verge of electing, the first black woman president, in this country, right? First woman president as well. But I think this is I think back to 2008. I think about the idea that it was the primary was kind of interesting, obviously, but by the time the general election came around, the economy was in shambles. So Obama not winning would have been like a shock, right? It would have been, this is a huge disaster. In this case, a very, very close election. The idea that Kamala Harris could actually beat Donald Trump right now, she's favored, very slim, but that's a big deal. That's, to me, a bigger deal in some ways than Obama winning in 2008 or winning re-election in 2012. It's really saying, this is a change. Harris is a generation younger than Joe Biden as well. So I think, so 60, but for young people, I think there's the idea that this is also a passing the baton in the Democratic Party, at least to some degree. Things are not perfect. People are going to be arguing and upset, young people in particular, very upset at a lot of issues that are going on around the world and in this country. Totally get it. But I think that, Harris is a really, really, really good candidate. Would be a really good president for Democrats in many ways, and for Republicans too, I think is what she would say. But, that is, she's a really, really good candidate for the Democratic Party, and she could win and defeat Donald Trump, who I think many Republicans say is a very flawed candidate for their party, not just for the nation, whatever. It's for the party. He is not the future of the party. It has to be someone else like J.D. Vance or whatever.
Oh, God, see, that's scary.
So
I'm losing my poker face at 31.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Yeah.
If he loses, he's done.
Yeah, it's probably the idea of moving forward, but I think Harris represents the future of the party, and I think that's really important.
And by the way, 60 is young.
Well, we'll end on that note. Thank you so much for an amazing panel.
Thank you, Sam, for ending on a somewhat hopeful note. I hope people's nerves are at least partially calmed. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the Guardian's Southeast Democracy reporter, George Chidi, who will be in conversation with Cliff Albright, co-founder of Black Voters Matter. A former reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, George's journalism career began in the U.S. Army and has ranged from covering the tech bubble in the 2000s to service as a small-town city councilman in Pine Lake, Georgia. He has written for Vice, Rolling Stone, Slate, and The Intercept, and contributes from time to time to local publications, Decatur-ish and Atlanta Magazine. His work over the last 2 years examines the causes of Atlanta's increase in violent crime and has won numerous awards: the inaugural John Lewis Writers Award from the Georgia Writers Association, a Good Trouble Honor from Atlanta's Center for Civic Innovation, a Guggenheim Fellowship for Crime Reporting, the National Award for Public Affairs Rating from the Society of Professional Journalists, an Ambie nomination for the podcast King Slime covering the Young Thug trial, and an Emmy nomination for his quarterly public affairs series, The Next Atlanta on Fox 5. George is coming to us straight from a Trump event in Zebulon, Georgia, and I'm sure he will be happy to tell you all about that. Cliff Albright is co-founder and executive director of Black Voters Matter Fund, which builds community and organizational capacity related to Black voting power. He's also the president of Strategic Cliff Notes, and he's written about voting rights for The Guardian. Cliff and I personally go back to 2018 when I spent a week on the Black Voters Matter bus, which they were calling the biggest black bus in America. And I got to see personally how effective their outreach is to Black voters across Georgia and across the South. In 2019, he wrote in The Guardian, of all the emergencies that this country currently faces, the electoral process and the overall health of U.S. democracy may be the most daunting. Without further ado, please welcome George and Cliff.
I was supposed to be here an hour ago. I was writing about Donald Trump and people leaving Donald Trump rallies early, because that happens all the time. This time they locked us in. Like, I was expecting to be able to leave at 4, and Secret Service said nobody gets to go. And I'm looking around, deer, like, in the headlights with a bunch of, like, everybody else going, we're stuck. Like, so my apologies. I should have been here before. But I'm glad I'm getting to talk to Cliff.
I'm glad you made it.
How? So I tell you, after that ordeal, I am tired, but I am motivated. Does that sound familiar?
It's actually the title of a article that I wrote in 22. In which, and it was actually at Selma. It was during the Selma commemoration, and I was reflecting at that time on being tired about a couple of things. Being tired about this battle around voting rights. Kira, it's amazing that you read that quote. I forgot that I wrote that in 2019. So before the big lie and before all that we've seen, it was very clear that, the defining issue of this period was going to be voting rights. But in that article, I was reflecting on being tired around that ongoing battle, and also being tired about some personal issues, some health challenges that I was facing at the time and still facing.
So I want to jump right into some stuff about, like, black voter turnout, your thing. I assume you've been watching the Secretary of State's website to see how things are going.
Every now and then.
Yeah. So I can't help but notice, while turnout is very robust, it's a little light in Savannah and it's a little light in Clayton County. What do you make of that?
So, look, a couple of things, right? On the one hand, what we're seeing is, and when people are saying it's light, what they're usually saying is they're looking at early vote in 2020. And early vote in 2020 was a whole different animal than what we're going to see this year, right? For obvious reasons, in the midst of 2020, all of the push was on vote by mail. If you couldn't vote by mail, it was to do early vote, right? And it's a little bit different now, right? There's still a push for early vote. Not as heavy on vote by mail amongst amongst black voters, and there's reasons for that, which goes back to the previous discussion around, the voter suppression. What we knew is after SB 202 was passed, that there were quantifiable differences because of the extra restrictions on voting by mail and ID restrictions. There was quantifiable differences in terms of the number of ballots being rejected. And lo and behold, disproportionately black, right? Who'd have thunk it, right? And so, there's a hesitancy around that, right? And you've got a lot of people who, unlike 2020, are like, I want to go back to voting, not just voting in person, but also voting in person on election day. Like, that's a tradition amongst some of our communities. So some of it is that. A lot of it obviously is the voter suppression that we're seeing, right? Which has an impact, even though that we've been able to win elections, right? And I want to be clear, I really want to level set. It's a little bit of a tangent, but I want to level set because we talk about the 2020 election nowadays, and we talk about the 2021 runoffs nowadays, and we say it, kind of like, it was destined to happen, right? Oh, yeah, we elected, we flipped the state, Biden won Georgia. Oh, yeah, and then we came back a couple of months later and elected the first black senator and the first Jewish senator, and then we keep the story going.
I would pay money for Helen Butler to be sitting there while you said, oh, yeah, it was just bound to happen.
Right.
Helen Butler, by the way, is an organizer who is the person who you want when you're trying to get voter turnout.
Right.
And she works like a crazy person.
Yes.
And, no, nothing happens. Nothing happens automatically.
Right. But we look back at it and we treat it that way. We forget that just weeks before those elections, both of them, 20 and the runoffs, we were having this same conversation about what are black folks going to do. We were having these same conversations about the polls. We were having these same conversations because keep in mind, again, 21 was a runoff. And traditional theory says what? That black voters, brown voters, low-income voters, they don't come out in a runoff, right? We had the audacity to come out at like a 90% clip of what the general was. So we talk about this like, oh, yeah, it was bound to happen, but we forget that we were having these same questions, these same doubts at that period of time. And what do? We shock the country, right? And so here we are now in a very similar situation. With that said, that doesn't mean that voter suppression doesn't exist. It impacted the 2020-21 elections. It impacted the midterm elections. It's going to impact this election. Not to say that means that black voters won't play a deciding role and others won't play a deciding role, but it's to say even when we have that success, it's not because the suppression doesn't exist. It's just because we're able to overcome it. It's similar to, I had an old school civil rights attorney, J.L. Chestnut, who was actually Dr. King's attorney during the Selma movement, and he used to say, if you take 10 people and you tie them up and you go out on a boat and you toss them aside, right? He said, one of them's going to inevitably come up to the top. He said, that's not a recipe that's not an endorsement for tying up people and tossing them over the boat or over the edge of the boat. Somebody's going to overcome the obstacle, but that doesn't mean that obstacle didn't exist.
Now, let me tell you why I was in Zebulon, Georgia. I'm writing a story that's looking to contrast the way Harris speaks about faith with the way Trump speaks about faith. And the Zebulon event was held at a church. It was supposed to be faith stuff. He really didn't talk about faith stuff. But Harris did. She was in South DeKalb Sunday. I don't suppose you were there, by the way, at New Birth. So she spoke at New Birth Missionary Baptist Church. Huge black church, mega church. They gave away $83 million in scholarships last year. I'm like, After she spoke, Pastor Jamal Bryant starts essentially telling people to go vote. But the terms he was putting it in were Manichaean. They were apocalyptic. They were, not to put too fine a point on it, sounding a lot like what I'm hearing from the right and the far right. In the sense of, this is the election that will determine the future of humanity, and you exist so that you can vote in this election, and your children and grandchildren yet to be born might not get born if you don't vote. Like,
where's the lie?
I'm paraphrasing, but that's real close. Like, and when you hear the right talk, and I'm bringing this up because you're talking about like the 2020 and 2021 elections where the message was like, this is it. Everything's on the line. Go vote. Are people burning out?
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't know if I'd say burning out, right? You do have some healthy skepticism, right, when you hear this every election cycle. I say it all the time when we go out. Look, y'all, I know every cycle that you hear that this is the most important election of our lifetime, right? But guess what? It really is. And it's not just that we're saying that because we're just trying to up the – there are, like, objective realities that exist in this election that have never existed before, right? Never had a president or a candidate saying, I'm going to be dictator on day one. Just never had that, right? Never had somebody running after sponsoring an insurrection at the Capitol and refusing to hand over power. That's never happened before, right? And the extension of that is that he refuses, and his running mate refuses to say that they wouldn't do the same thing. So there are objective reasons why this really is a different election, the likes of which we have never seen before. And that's before you even get into all the other policies that are at stake of abortion rights and women's controls of the bodies, or, you know, racial justice in this country, or health care, whether or not we have health care or we just are left with concepts of a plan. Like, and so there are real reasons why it really is in many ways an existential election that we're facing.
So I will ask, in that context, what argument, and here you lead people who knock on doors and say, black people, please vote. What messages, and am I condensing a lot of what you do to like what messages land? What will turn somebody who's like, I'm going golfing to, yeah, all right, I got to go vote.
I wish I could give you a simple answer, but the reality is it depends on the person, because everybody has a different issue that drives them to make that decision, right? For one person, it is the economy, right? It's the economy, stupid. It's inflation. It's the cost of whatever. For other people, it's abortion rights, right? And that goes for men and women. We are in a state where many of you know about Amber Thurman or Candy Miller. These are women, black women, that have lost their lives because of an election ban, right? And that's an issue that doesn't just affect women, that affects men, because they have husbands or brothers or children or uncles or whatever. So I've had conversations with brothers that are literally just as passionate about that issue and so for some people that's the issue. So there is no one issue. And so when I cringed a little when you said, hey, please go vote, that's because that's not the conversation. We lead the conversation with, at least those of us in our organization and the partner groups that we work with, we root the discussion not in the voting process. We root it in what it is that they want for their lives, their family, their community. What is the issue that drives them? If all I'm going to do is talk about the clipboard and I need you to register and I center that process, then I've lost them. We're not in a dialogue at that point. But I've seen it, people get surprised because they're used to people asking them that question or presenting that information and making that demand. And I have literally seen somebody who was very much anti, oh, I don't want to talk to you. No, I don't want to feel that, or whatever. And I say, what's the thing that keeps you up at night? And then sometimes they freeze, like literally freeze. Like, I was not expecting that question. And then they start talking about it. And now we're in a discussion, which at some point, guess what? It's going to come right back around to what? How connected that thing that they're passionate about is to the voting process. And so I say all this to say that, when we understand that, then that's how you turn, we had an article we wrote some years ago, how to turn a non-voter into a voter. That's how you turn a non-voter into a voter, by not focusing on the voting, but focusing on them.
So I want to ask about Donald Trump's at least initial outreach to black men. There was a lot of press and a lot of noise and a lot of barbershop stuff, like about, hey, Donald Trump. Like, and I run into black guys who are going to vote for Donald Trump every once in a while. Like, How sincere do you think that was? Do you think that was effective? Do you think that there was any? Do you think that there's meaningful movement there? I don't, but I'm curious about what you're thinking.
No, I think you and I agree. I don't think it's that effective. I don't think the numbers are moving all that much. It's not going to be a major shift. You know, the biggest shift that took place in terms of the ways that black men vote isn't going to be the shift from 4 years ago to this year. It wasn't even a shift from 12 to 16. The biggest shift, as you probably know, George, was when? It was from 2008 to 2012.
Yeah.
When Obama lost a segment of black men and women, right, because of the issues.
He was still overperforming relative to, like, a Clinton, I think.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. But an 8-point drop, you know, from 95% of black men to 87%, that's a significant drop. And so, you know, so you've got a range of things going on. One, and somebody said it earlier, you do have like some real issues in our community with black men that want to see more out of governance, want to see more out of this country, want to see more out of Democrats and Republicans, right? You have that. But you also have a large number who are simply being subjected to massive amounts of disinformation. There's no other group who has been the target of more disinformation than black men, and in particular younger black men. And this isn't even just this year. This goes back to 2016. This is not conspiracy theory. There's whole reports on both international players as well as domestic players and the amount of... So the question that I always bounce back to people when people say, well, what's going on with black men? Why aren't they voting Harris more, right? I say the real question is this: how remarkable is it that in spite of everything that we face, in spite of all the shortcomings that we actually face in this country, right, in spite of the massive amounts of disinformation that is taught, how amazing it is that black men still even continue to participate in this thing and still remain the second most reliable progressive voting bloc in the country, second only to black women. That should be the nature of the case study. How amazing is it that you still withstand and are resilient to all the forces that should have you? Think about this. You had people, MAGA people, right, after 2000 say, oh, it's corrupt, voter fraud, I'm not participating. After one election, and made up stories, right? Now, what happens if you've had not just one election, but election after election after election? And what happens when it's not made up stories, but actual suppression that you're facing, and you still participate? That is a remarkable story, and that story has not been told.
Do you see regional differences? Like, one of the values of the work that you're doing is that it's not just Georgia. Like North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, Michigan. Does outreach look differently? Does the conversation you hear sound different in Michigan than it does here?
Fundamentally, no, right? If you're having that process that I just described, it's the same whether you're in Alabama or whether you're in Michigan or in Pennsylvania, right? That process of centering what it is. Now, what the issue is that you hear might vary. And even that doesn't change much, right? In Jackson, Mississippi, you're talking about polluted water, and in Flint, Michigan, you talk about polluted water, right? In Georgia, you're talking about voter suppression, and in Ohio, you're talking about voter suppression. So the issues change a little bit, but not much. But the nature of the process, you got to knock on doors, you got to make some phone calls, you got to send some text messages, you got to do some social media, and first and foremost, you got to center the person or people that you're talking to. That process, and that is what's at the end. You got to find some way to bring some black love and black joy into that process. Because if all we're going to do is talk about how heavy it is, and this is heavy, this is really, that's my wife back there testifying. But she's not just my wife. She is really our third co-founder, and she's also our chief of staff and legal director. And we'll tell you, right, that on any given day, one of us is fed up. And we always say we can't both be fed up at the same time, right? One of us got to be able to lift the other one up. You got to have some black love and black joy in this work, or else it's not sustainable. And more importantly, every person that you talk to is going to feel that. They will feel your fear. They will fear your depression. They will fear all that. And the flip side is that if you really believe in this work, if you're really driven by that love, guess what? They're going to feel that too. And so that's why we always talk about within our circles, we got to believe in this work that we do. This ain't play work. This ain't performative. We either believe in this thing that we're talking about, this liberation and freedom and rights, or we don't.
So one of the things I want to talk about is this idea of the black voter is not a monolith. Even though some of the issues rhyme. My family, like half of my family, is Nigerian. And there's this peculiar cultural and economic conservative strain in sort of black immigrant communities, and you've seen it. And I think that's fundamentally different in some ways from somebody who was born and raised in South Atlanta, who is different from somebody who's a relative professional who moved to Atlanta because all this opportunity is here, who might be different from somebody who grew up with money in Atlanta. Are there archetypes in your head here when you're thinking about, like, do you segment like a marketer as you're trying to get at this stuff?
I'm glad you asked that, George. So, we have some friends at an organization. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of Hit Strategies. It's a black-led polling organization. And they've done some really good research. And it's not just them, but they're the latest iteration of this that is literally broken down into 5 archetypes. And it's from like what we usually call the super voter, but they have a different name for it. It's like the older, traditional, democratic, reliable voter. And then it ranges from there down to like the skeptical, younger voters, the kind of like the Black Lives Matter, but they're not really into the electoral process. So and that's just 5 archetypes that they listed out, right? But there's really much more than that. Like, even going back to your question about the geographic, about the regional differences, really the probably where you see more difference is you see more difference between like Atlanta and Cairo, Georgia, right, down South Georgia, than necessarily between Atlanta and Detroit. And so, because you got rural communities that, there is a little bit of a different, just a different culture than in some of our urban areas. So there's several different archetypes, and we know that within all of those, there is some conservative strain, right? There is some, it's no secret that, we've got a lot of people in our community that if you ask them what they would do personally about abortion, they'll say no, never. But you ask them how they feel about the constitutional right to an abortion, and they'll say hell yes, right? We've always been able to separate out our social conservatism from our political conservatism. Those are not necessarily the same thing. And so being able to recognize that in the ways that we talk to our voters, ways that we talk to our community members is very important.
Yeah. And I bring this up because, like, that kind of segmentation, the sort of deep dive understanding of a community, I think is applicable outside of just looking at black voters. Like, that this is a process that literally anybody who is trying to engage in democracy, run for public office, would do well to understand. Like, I'm thinking about the lessons you're learning that apply more broadly to politics at large.
And the sad reality is, I believe that the conservatives, MAGA world, actually does that segmentation better than what we do, because they are very good at picking out, and really what their segmentation is finding the grievance and doing the psychoanalysis to find out not what your hopes and dreams are, but what is your grievance. And for some people, that grievance is transgender is taking over the world. For other people, it's that men are being left behind by women who are doing better than us. For other people, it's the grievance is the criminal justice system is doing wrong, and there's no such thing as a progressive DA, right? There's some grievance, and they find it. And once they find it, they harp on it, and they flood you with information. There are commercials going on right now on conservative, rural, black church radio stations that most of us are not hearing and know nothing about. But on a regular basis, they're hearing about transgender people taking over the country. right? And so we just generally have not been that sophisticated at it, and in large part because we try to speak to like the whole individual and to the better angels of our nature and all of that. But when all you got to do is find one grievance, that's a much easier job, and that's what they do well.
They were trying for that with black men. Like, I think they were like, that's, and actually I want to talk about black men as a issue that I don't think is separate from race in the sense of the gender gap. I tell people, like, there's a gender gap in white voters too. Like, I mean, white guys are much more likely to vote for a Republican than white women are, and I think the gap is about the same range. I think it explains a lot of the difference, but for that, those, like, there would be no difference between black men and black women voting.
I'm going to tell you a secret. When you're a man in a patriarchal society, you're going to be more conservative, because the very definition of conservative is you want things, you want to conserve the way that things are. So if you're benefiting relatively, right, then odds are at least some segment of you are going to be kind of cool with keeping things patriarchal, right? And so that's why you see some men in here real uncomfortable right now. And so that's why, as you said, that gap is not a black. When we talk about this, so often it's like there's something wrong with black men. Why aren't black men keeping up with black women? You never hear the discussion around why are white men more conservative than white women? Why are Latino men more conservative? You don't really hear that discussion. But with black men, it's like, what are y'all doing? Y'all are failing. Y'all are losers, right? And so it's important to, and that's not to say that any of the patriarchy is okay, but it's to say that we're not like exceptionally, so that there's something, we go back to many of you know about the culture of pathology, right? Going back to the 60s and 70s, right? That there's something wrong with you, something wrong with the black family. And so this whole analysis of black men voters is very reminiscent of some of that discussion.
So I'm going to get one more thing, and then I think we're going to go questions. But so a devil's advocate question. What could, the whole of conservative policy seems to be oriented towards screwing black people. I'm just going to say it. I look for examples of conservative policy where black people would do better than white people, and that they'd support it. And I can't think of one. But I've got in the back of my head, I want there to be a bidding war for the black vote. Like, I want both of them to be like, all right, we'll give you this. No, we'll give you that. And because I want my vote to be that much more valuable. What do you think conservatives could offer black people that wouldn't utterly alienate their voting base? That, how do you get to politics where it's not so racially polarized?
So, after the 2012 election, the Republican Party was at this crossroads, right? They did a whole autopsy asking this very question, right? And if some very smart people said, hey, if we actually come up with some policies that favor black people and favor brown people, right, that will get more support. So how about that? And instead they chose white supremacy. Right, the old reliable, right? It's worked for 200 years. Let's keep it going, right? And so, but the reality is that there are some. I always say every piece of disinformation is based on a kernel of truth, and so all of the disinformation that they're flooding our communities with is always based on a little bit of a kernel, right? Is there a kernel of truth to that the immigration issue is causing some challenges in some of our cities, right? Whether it's New York or Chicago, there's a kernel of truth in that, right? There are some, no, they're not eating the dogs and the cats, but there are some, some stresses on different services and all that. There's a kernel of truth there, but then you take it and you add all this other stuff. And in the process, you forget to ask the question in New York and in Chicago, where are they coming from? Because we're not a border state. Right? And so, they're coming from Canada and New York. Where are they coming from? It's Republican governors that have literally sent them there. But put that aside for a second, right? The point is that there's always something there that is a real, like I said, grievance, a real problem, a real issue, however you want to describe it. And the fact of the matter is that Republicans could come up with some policies that actually solved some problems, right? That actually spoke to some black men or other black voters who are kind of like, hey, Democrats, I do kind of want more. I do want an agenda. They could have come up with everything that Kamala Harris just came up with on her agenda for black men. They could have come up with black men health issues, right? Economic issues, right? They could have come up with that. But instead, they've chosen to go the white supremacy route, to actually fight against affirmative action, anti-blackness, to fight against black history, and to fight against funding for black farmers. And like you said, literally, their whole platform is rooted in anti-blackness, and that was a choice.
So, yes, do it. And I got to tell you, like, a whole lot of you either are journalists or should be. Let's start with this. Let's start with the policies for black men. Okay. How resonant are Harris's policies for black men? For black men, like, what's the reaction been?
You know, it's really interesting. So I'll give you a couple of reactions. One, even before it came out, we did just a survey between our staff and some partners and others before the agenda came out, because there was already this discussion going around about black men and, you know, what do we want and all that. And we came up with a range of issues. And on that list of issues, there's literally about 10 different issues. One of them dealt with healthcare, right? Dealt with issues like prostate cancer and diabetes. Another issue dealt with mental health. Another issue dealt with legalizing marijuana, right? A subsection of that issue was don't just legalize it, but we need to be able to participate in the legalization and in the economy that comes out of it, right? Any of this sounding familiar? And so it was this whole list of things, which literally, like, maybe a week and a half later, when she unveiled the agenda,
this was you.
All of these things were in there, right? And so it speaks to a lot of issues that black men have been talking about, because the most frustrating thing whenever I've had the discussion and a brother was like, oh, I don't know if I'm feeling, you know, I don't know if she's dealing with my issues. And I'll say, well, what issue do you want to have her deal with? And inevitably, whatever the issue was that they said, she had already dealt with, right? And so, yes, it's resonating. So for some men, it's answering that question and it's answering that need of wanting to see something for us, right? There are some, though, that are still going to be like, that's not enough, it's too late, you know, I still don't like your laugh. I mean, you know, just coming up with all kinds of things. And for those people, you got to get to the point of discussion where, and I've done this, right? Come on, brother, is it just because she's a woman? Oh, no, that's not what it is. No. You know, it's not that I don't think a woman could be, but I don't think the country's ready for a female president. Right?
Heard that.
You've heard that, right? Right? And so anyway, so there's some segment that's a thing. But guess what? Most of that segment was already voting Republican, right? Or they weren't voting, right? To your point earlier. Most of that segment was already, and truth be told, probably not going to vote this time either. But most of that segment was, because guess what? 10% of us have already been voting Republican for a long time now. Even before George Bush and the faith-based money that he was giving out. Like, there's a history of that.
Around money. Old school. There's another one. Again, whoever you are. And I know this is important to you. How do you see black solidarity with Palestinians affecting turnout? See?
It is, without a doubt, the hardest issue I face this election cycle. And I don't even just mean that politically, just personally. I've, going back to October, November of last year, had been communicating to anybody close to Biden, White House, anything, that this was going to be an issue. And it was a political issue, but it was also a moral issue. And this was early on, like before it got to 40,000 or whatever the actual number is, because you could see what was coming. And so Oh, and I mean, we were in Chicago at the DNC. We were talking to folks on the uncommitted movement who scaled down their demands to a certain extent, and at great cost, because they had people within their own movement calling them sellouts and all that, but scaled down their demands to the point where it finally reached the point where all they were asking for is, let us speak. And it was painful to watch them not even being able to be acknowledged and to have a voice. It's like it was the metaphor, it was the playing out of the silencing and the erasure that we're seeing in real time, but just in that simple moment of you can't even have a voice. It's a very difficult issue, and it's hard to. Like I said, we were just in Detroit just this weekend while the vice president was at the church. We were up in Detroit, and I couldn't even imagine going to Dearborn and saying, "Hey, y'all, come on, let's do this." Like I couldn't ask that of a certain community, right? That's literally seen dozens of their personal family members wiped out. So it's a very difficult issue, and it does it. Yes, we all know Trump he wants to have riverfront, he wants to have, beach property in Gaza, right? He wants them to finish the job. Nikki Haley wanted them to finish the job, right? And so we know that it will be exponentially worse, but it's hard to make an argument about what exponentially worse looks like when you've already lost 20 family members. Right, so so we have been in solidarity in whatever ways we could, but we've also been very clear that we have got to win this election for there to be any kind of a future in Gaza and Palestine.
Alpha Kappa Alpha. This is Kamala Harris's sorority. And let me tell you.
Who asked that question? Who's there?
See, this is what I'm telling you. Like, every time you go to a rally, or just sort of walking around the street right now, pink and green everywhere. Like, they're going to run the country if she wins. That's going to be interesting. There's a movie.
Somebody close to me said they will be insufferable.
Yeah. Might have been me. How does this change black turnout? Does this engage more than just college-educated black people?
Maybe, right? I mean, certainly it energizes the entire D9, who we've, as Black Voters Matter, we've had for years now a great relationship with the D9. We provide many grants to organizations. There's certain blocks of organizations that we always support, and D9 is always incredibly active at helping us to mobilize our communities, right? Not everybody on the street really cares about, what your fraternity or sorority is. But it does counteract, to a certain extent, some of what we hear, right, in terms of, oh, she's not black. Or as, Trump said, she just became black, right? And so, for folks that, are skeptical of her blackness, to whatever extent that's a thing, it does mean something that she's a member of the oldest black sorority in the country. It does mean something that she went to an HBCU. Even if you're not in that circle, it gets kind of hard for you to dismiss her lived experience as a black and South Asian woman when she's got these experiences, including working at McDonald's as I did, but she's got these experiences that are very, definitively black experiences.
One last question. So what do you think the ceiling is for black male vote participation? What's the most that reasonably that we could expect?
In terms of turnout or in terms of support for?
Turnout. Start with turnout, and then we talk about support.
Yeah, I'm an organizer, so I'm an eternal optimist. I think I'll just give you an example. In 2020, we actually had data that says out of all the people that we touched, the millions of black folks that we touched just in the state of Georgia, we had a 65% turnout rate amongst people that we touched. which is, it's not great by international standards, right? But within domestically, that's not bad. And particularly when you think about the fact that we don't just touch like super voters. We have a very different approach that we take. Some organization, that's all they talk to, because you want to be smart about how you spend your budgets and all that. But we go another direction. We talk to the hardest people to talk to, right? And sometimes in the parts of the state that are the hardest to get to. And so when 65% of our folks that we touch turn out, that's saying something. And so I'm shooting for, at least that amount for Black men. I think we can get there.
Cliff Albright.
Let's give a warm thank you again to Carol Anderson, Bernard Fraga, Alan Abramowitz, Sam Levine. Before saying a final goodnight, I also just want to extend some other thank yous. First of all, to all of you, our great audience, thanks for turning out. I want to thank the Carlos Museum for hosting us in this beautiful space. I want to give my deepest gratitude to my incredible staff in the Fox Center, May Veloso-Lyons, Kaylin McAdams, and Carl Mary Acray. Thank you. Thank you also to Julie Mashak and Kira Lerner at The Guardian, who did an amazing job and have just been the most gracious collaborators. I really appreciate it. I want to thank all of the scholars, the teachers, the journalists, the activists, the volunteers who are working tirelessly to unearth and analyze the threats to democracy today and the historical forces that have gotten us here, to boldly and unabashedly reveal what the stakes are, and to work to bolster this delicate system we inhabit. If you have not already done so, please go out and vote. Please know that tonight's program has been recorded, and along with our last event, Why Democracy is in Danger with Steve Levitsky and Carol Anderson, you may access tonight's recording for all of our public events on the Fox Center website. You might have noticed that tonight's event, this really important gathering, was free and open to the public. We also welcome your contributions on our website to help further the activities of the Fox Center. This concludes our program, and I just want to say hearty thanks to all of you.